I have spent a very long time building walls out of my own achievements, hoping they would look like a life from the outside. But when I sit alone in the quiet mornings, before the world wakes up and demands that I become the version of myself everyone else expects, those walls start to look more like a cage. I need you to hear this honestly because you are the only person who might actually understand the difference between who I was trying to be and who I actually became. For years, I told myself that the noise and the chasing were just the price of admission for a significant life. I thought that if I ran fast enough, if I dreamed big enough, the momentum alone would carry me past the things I wasn't ready to face. I thought I knew what I was doing. I thought I understood the stakes. I thought I was ready for whatever came next. But looking back at the beginning of this road, I see a man who was utterly blind to the weight of his own ambition. When you start out with nothing but a horizon in your mind, everything looks like an invitation. I remember standing in empty rooms, staring out of windows at cities that didn't know my name yet, feeling this terrifying, intoxicating certainty that I was meant to conquer them. It wasn't just about success, it was about survival, or at least that's what I told myself to justify the sheer blinding scale of what I wanted. I wanted to build something that couldn't be broken, something that would prove I belonged in a room long after I had left it. It is a strange thing to look back at your younger self and feel both a deep, aching pity and a profound sense of estrangement. He was so sure of his trajectory, so entirely convinced that the world could be bent to his will if he just refused to sleep, refused to feel, and refused to stop. Have you ever realized a victory cost more than you expected? I didn't know then that the very dreams that keep you awake at night can become the things that slowly put your humanity to sleep. This is the part I rarely talk about, mostly because it requires admitting how much I substituted motion for meaning. In those early years, the road was everything. I fell in love with the distance, with the feeling of leaving things behind before they could complicate my focus. I remember late nights on highways where the headlights were the only solid thing in the universe, watching the signs flash past like a countdown to a destination I hadn't even fully defined. I was running toward a future that was supposed to fix everything, a future where I would finally feel complete, secure, and validated. But the trouble with dreaming bigger than reality is that reality has a way of feeling like an insult. The ordinary days, the quiet conversations, the simple act of staying still, they all felt like obstacles to the grand narrative I was writing for myself. I viewed my own life as a draft, a prefix to the real story that would begin once I finally arrived. But I didn't understand that yet. I didn't see that every time I chose the horizon over the room I was actually standing in, I was chipping away at my capacity to be present. I thought I was sacrificing for a greater good, that the loneliness of those early frantic efforts was just a temporary tax I had to pay. I recall sitting in an empty office after everyone else had gone home, the silence thick and heavy around me, staring at a screen and feeling a sudden, sharp pang of isolation that I immediately pushed down. I told myself it was just fatigue. I told myself that once the work was done, the loneliness would vanish. Maybe you've felt something similar, that quiet suspicion in the middle of a crowded room or a busy day that you are entirely on your own, operating on an island of your own making. I ignored that suspicion because to acknowledge it would mean admitting that the blueprint I had drawn for my life was deeply, fundamentally flawed. What if the thing you were chasing wasn't the thing you needed? That is the question that haunts the edges of those early memories now. I spent so much energy trying to prove that I was capable of building a world, but I never stopped to ask what kind of man would have to live inside it. I wanted to be strong, I wanted to be reliable, and I wanted to be someone who could look at any challenge and say I handled it alone. It was a pride so thick it felt like armor. But armor doesn't just keep the weapons out, it keeps the warmth from getting in, too. I look at old photographs from that time, and I don't see a conqueror. I see a young man holding his breath, waiting for the applause to tell him he can finally breathe out. I was trying to buy my way into a sense of belonging through effort, through achievements that I could stack up against my insecurities, like sandbags against a rising tide. Stay with me, because this changed everything. Even if the change was so slow, I barely noticed it happening at first. The dreams didn't fail. That's the trick of it. If they had failed early on, I might have learned the lesson sooner. Instead, they worked just enough to keep me addicted to the pursuit. They grew larger, more demanding, swallowing up the margins of my life until there was nothing left but the work, the road, and the quiet panic of keeping it all moving forward. I thought that to be worthy of someone's belief, to be worthy of your belief, though I didn't know your face yet, I had to present a finished product. I believed I had to be a monument instead of a human being. I was building a version of myself that was entirely self-sufficient, completely unaware that the very thing I was constructing would eventually become the greatest barrier to the connection I actually craved. I left a light on in another room, always expecting to walk into it later, always believing that the real living would happen tomorrow. The trouble with getting what you think you want is that you are suddenly forced to live inside the reality of your own choices. By the time I entered the next phase of this road, the early, frantic energy had solidified into something much heavier, a relentless, unyielding momentum that I no longer knew how to slow down. I need you to look at me when I say this, because this is where the cost of ambition stops being a theoretical concept and starts leaving actual marks. I had built the engine, and now the engine was running me. I found myself navigating a world of constant movement, moving from airport terminals to identical hotel rooms, always arriving but never actually being anywhere. I thought that this was what achievement felt like. I thought that the constant buzz of pressure and the endless list of demands were proof that I had made it, that I was finally becoming the man I was supposed to be. But looking back, I see it differently now. I wasn't building a kingdom. I was just creating a very expensive distraction from the void growing inside my own chest. Every ambition has a price tag, but they never show you the total until you've already signed the contract. For me, the cost was paid in the currency of presence. I remember sitting in late-night meetings where important decisions were being made, looking around the table at men who looked exactly like me, exhausted, driven, and utterly disconnected from anything resembling a soul, and realizing that we were all participating in a collective lie. We told ourselves that what we were doing mattered more than the quiet lives we were leaving behind in the shadows. I missed phone calls from people who cared about me, leaving them to ring out in the dark because I was too busy presenting a version of myself to strangers who wouldn't remember my name a year later. Have you ever realized that a victory cost more than you expected? I was winning the games I had chosen to play, but the trophies felt hollow the moment they were placed in my hands. The cost was the slow, almost imperceptible numbing of my own capacity to feel anything deeply. And that mistake followed me longer than I expected. I thought I could compartmentalize my life, that I could give my absolute best to the pursuit of success and save a small, pristine corner of my heart for the people who actually mattered. But human hearts don't work that way. When you train yourself to be cold, efficient, and guarded so that you can survive the pressure of your ambitions, you don't magically become soft and open the moment you walk through your own front door. You carry the armor with me. I remember watching the seasons change through the double-paned glass of high-rise office buildings, realizing that another year had slipped through my fingers like sand, leaving nothing behind but a spreadsheet of accomplishments and a growing sense of alienation. I was becoming an expert at managing my life, but I was completely failing at living it. This is the part I rarely talk about because it is deeply embarrassing to admit that you succeeded at the wrong things. Don't rush past this part because I need you to understand the specific kind of blindness that ambition inflicts. I truly believed that if I just reached the next milestone, if I just secured the next contract or hit the next financial target, I would finally earn the right to stop running. I thought that the exhaustion was temporary, a bridge I had to cross to get to a land of permanent security. But the horizon kept moving. Every time I reached the place that was supposed to be the destination, I found that the road stretched out just as far ahead of me as it did behind. I was caught in a loop of my own design. I remember standing in a beautifully furnished apartment I could finally afford, looking around at the pristine surfaces and the silence, and feeling a terrifying wave of panic. I had everything I had set out to get, yet I felt more impoverished than I did when I was broke and dreaming in an empty room. Maybe you've felt something similar. The quiet terror of realizing that the map you've been following your whole life was drawn by someone who didn't know where they were going. I had followed all the rules of strategy, effort, and discipline, but I had entirely left out the human element. I had built a life that looked incredible from a distance, but up close, there was no warmth in it. There was no room for vulnerability, no space for mistakes, and certainly no room for love. I thought that to be strong meant being unbreakable, but the truth is that things that cannot bend eventually shatter. I was carrying the weight of my own manufactured identity, terrified that if I let it drop for even a second, everyone would see that underneath the success, I was still just a boy trying to prove he was enough. I thought that to win your respect, to be a man worthy of a real future, I had to be flawless. I didn't know that flaws are the only places where two people can actually connect. I thought I knew. I thought I understood. I thought I was ready to handle the consequences of my drive. But the road has a way of collecting its debts when you least expect it. The cracks were starting to form, not in the structure of my career, but in the foundation of who I was as a person. I was becoming irritable, tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix, and increasingly desperate for a kind of peace that I couldn't buy. I had left a light on in another room, a quiet space where I imagined I would one day sit down and just breathe. But the doorway to that room was becoming harder to find. I was locked out of my own life, standing on the outside looking in, wondering how a journey that started with such pure intentions had brought me to a place of such profound isolation. The cost of ambition wasn't just the time I lost. It was the person I had to become to pay it. The first cracks always appear where you aren't looking, in the quiet corners of your life where you assumed you were safe. For me, it started with the silence. I had built a career out of answering every call, solving every crisis, and being the loudest, most capable voice in the room. But when the noise finally cleared at the end of the day, the silence felt deafening. I need you to hear this honestly, because this is the moment the illusion began to fail. I remember standing in a kitchen that was too clean, staring at a refrigerator that held nothing but takeout containers, and realizing that the life I had built had no actual life in it. It was a perfectly staged set, but there were no actors, no laughter, and no shared memories holding the walls up. I had thought that by eliminating distractions, by keeping people at a distance and treating relationships like tasks to be managed, I was protecting my focus. Instead, I had just built a very efficient desert. You don't notice the erosion while it's happening because you're too busy maintaining the exterior. I kept showing up to the meetings, kept hitting the targets, and kept smiling for the photographs. But internally, the joints were starting to give way. I remember an evening after a major milestone, the kind of achievement that was supposed to validate months of grueling effort, when everyone else went out to celebrate, and I walked back to my hotel room alone. I sat on the edge of a bed that wasn't mine in a city I barely knew, and I couldn't find a single reason to celebrate. The victory didn't taste like anything. It just felt like a relief that the pressure had stopped for a few hours. Have you ever realized a victory cost more than you expected? That night, I realized I had traded my capacity for joy just to buy a temporary freedom from anxiety. I was terrified that if I stopped running, the momentum would collapse and reveal that I had absolutely nothing else to stand on. This is the part I rarely talk about, because admitting weakness feels like a betrayal of the person I spent decades trying to become. I started experiencing these sudden, unprovoked moments of self-doubt that would hit me in the middle of ordinary days. I would be speaking to a client or reviewing a contract, and a voice would whisper, "How long do you think you can keep this up before they see through you?" It wasn't imposter syndrome. It was the terrifying realization that the person they were talking to wasn't me at all. It was a character I had invented, a mask crafted from discipline, ambition, and fear. The real me was somewhere far behind that mask, starved of air, attention, and companionship. I had become a stranger to myself, and because I didn't know who I was, I certainly couldn't let anyone else close enough to find out. I thought that by hiding my cracks, I was keeping myself safe. I didn't see that the cracks were the only places where a real life could begin to take root. Look at me when I say this, because I don't want you to mistake this for a tragedy. It was a necessary breaking. I thought I knew, I thought I understood, I thought I was ready to carry the weight of my choices forever. But the human spirit has a limit, and mine was signaling that it had reached it long before my ego was willing to admit defeat. I began to find excuses to avoid the very things I used to chase. I would sit in my car in airport parking lots for an extra 20 minutes, just staring at the steering wheel, unable to force myself to walk inside and board another for flight. I would look at letters that needed replies and leave them sitting on my desk for weeks, watching the dust collect on them like a physical manifestation of my own paralysis. I was running out of the fuel that had powered me for a lifetime, the belief that what I was doing would eventually matter. Maybe you've felt something similar, that quiet, terrifying moment when the engine of your life simply refuses to turn over, no matter how hard you turn the key. It is an incredibly lonely place to be, especially when the world is still looking at you and expecting you to perform. I was so deeply ashamed of my own exhaustion that I turned that shame outward, becoming cold and distant to the few people who still tried to reach through the fog. I convinced myself that they couldn't possibly understand the pressure I was under, that their lives were simpler, lighter, and somehow less significant than the burden I had chosen to bear. It was a toxic, arrogant defense mechanism designed to protect my pride, but all it did was ensure that when the crash finally came, I would be entirely alone. I was cutting the safety lines one by one, believing I was freeing myself, when I was actually just casting myself adrift. Looking back, I see it differently now. The first cracks weren't the beginning of the end. They were an invitation to change the direction of the journey. But I was too stubborn, too fearful of what people would think if I admitted that the great experiment had failed. I thought that if I just changed the scenery, if I took a different role, moved to a different office, or found a new project to lose myself in, the structural damage would fix itself. I was still trying to solve an internal problem with external adjustments. I left a light on in another room, a quiet space, where I promised myself I would one day go to figure out who I actually was, but I kept the door locked because I was terrified of what I would find waiting for me inside. I was still running, but the road was no longer a path to a dream. It was just an escape route from the truth. When you realize the structure you've built is beginning to fail, your first instinct isn't to fix the foundation, it's to run. You look for a back door, a detour, a brand new stretch of road that promises a fresh start without requiring you to carry the baggage of your old mistakes. This is the part I rarely talk about because running from the truth is a coward's game, and for a long time, I played it with absolute dedication. I packed up my ambitions, changed my scenery, and convinced myself that a new environment would miraculously wash away the exhaustion and alienation I had accumulated over the years. I thought that if I could just outrun my past, I could invent a version of myself that didn't carry the scars of the first cracks. But the terrain changes, the cities change, and yet the mirror always stays exactly the same. I became a master of geographical cures. I threw myself into new projects with a frantic, desperate energy, trying to recreate the intoxication of those early years when the horizon felt clean and full of promise. I stayed in motion, believing that as long as I was moving, the truth couldn't catch up to me. I spent months living out of suitcases, navigating airport terminals where every face was a blur, finding a strange, hollow comfort in the fact that no one in these new places knew my history or my failures. They only saw the resume. They only saw the man who could deliver results. I thought I was liberating myself. I thought I was taking control of the narrative. But in reality, I was just a fugitive from my own life, terrified of what would happen if the music stopped, and I was forced to sit in an empty room with nothing but my own thoughts. What if the delay carried a purpose? What if the very act of running was just a long, agonizing circle designed to bring me back to the place where I had to look at myself honestly? I didn't see that then. I remember one specific night in a hotel room overlooking a city I had no connection to, watching the rain streak down the glass, feeling an overwhelming sense of futility. I had just closed a deal that should have felt like a massive victory, but inside, the silence was louder than ever. I picked up the phone to call someone. Anyone who might know the real me, but I realized my address book was full of contacts and completely devoid of friends. I had spent so much time running from the truth that I had successfully managed to run away from everyone who cared enough to tell it to me. Have you ever looked around your life and realized you've built a fortress that keeps out everything good along with everything bad? I thought I knew what freedom looked like. I thought it meant having no anchors, no obligations that couldn't be dissolved with a contract, and no emotional dependencies that could make me vulnerable. I thought I was ready to live a life completely self-contained, but that kind of freedom is indistinguishable from a prison sentence. And that mistake followed me longer than I expected. Because every time I tried to settle down, every time a quiet moment threatened to break through the armor, I would feel that familiar, frantic urge to pack up and leave again. I was terrified of being known, because to be known meant being seen in all my incompletion, all my exhaustion, and all my regret. I thought that to be a man you could look at with respect, I had to keep the illusion alive at all costs. I didn't understand that the illusion was the very thing keeping us a universe apart. Stay with me, because this is where the momentum finally began to work against me. You can only run for so long before your body, your mind, or your circumstances simply refuse to take another step. The running wasn't working anymore. The new projects felt just as hollow as the old ones. The new cities looked identical to the ones I had left behind, and the distraction of the work was losing its power to numb the ache in my chest. I was running out of road, and the truth I had been sprinting away from was waiting for me at the end of every single path I took. I began to see that the problem wasn't the city, the career, or the people around me. The problem was the man carrying the suitcase. I had left a light on in another room, a space of honesty I had promised myself I would enter when I was finally ready, but I was starting to realize that readiness is a lie we tell ourselves to justify our cowardice. Look at me when I say this, because I need you to understand that I am not proud of this chapter. It was a period of profound selfishness, masked as survival. I used people as milestones, used work as a shield, and used the road as an excuse to avoid the terrifying work of looking inward. I thought I was navigating a complex destiny, but I was really just a man afraid of his own shadow, running through the dark, hoping to find a sun that didn't require him to sweat. The movement had ceased to be an adventure, it had become a sentence. And, as the noise of the running began to fade, a new and terrifying landscape was beginning to reveal itself. A place of absolute, unavoidable stillness, where the only voice left to listen to was my own. When you finally run out of road, you are forced to confront the one thing you spent a lifetime trying to outrun, the absolute crushing weight of your own isolation. Facing loneliness is not a dramatic event. It doesn't arrive with a thunderclap or a crisis that forces you to your knees. Instead, it settles in like a slow, freezing mist on a quiet morning after the world has stopped asking for the version of you that performs. For me, this phase of the journey was defined by a profound and sudden stillness that felt less like peace and more like an interrogation. I had successfully cleared my schedule, moved away from the frantic demands of my old career, and stepped into a space where there was no noise left to distract me. I remember sitting in a house that felt too large, watching the afternoon light slide across the floorboards, and realizing that the silence in the room was a perfect mirror for the silence inside my own chest. I had spent decades believing that my solitude was a badge of honor, a necessary sacrifice for a man of focus and ambition. But in that stillness, the lie finally fell away. I need you to hear this honestly, because this is the moment I stopped looking at my life as a series of strategic maneuvers and started looking at it as an empty room I had deliberately locked myself inside of. The transition from productive solitude to hollow isolation happens so quietly that you don't even notice you've crossed the border until the landscape is entirely barren. In those months, My life became a rhythm of long roads at night, driving with no destination just to feel the illusion of progress, and sitting in diner booths where the chatter of strangers only emphasized how completely disconnected I was from the human fabric. I thought I was healing, I thought I was resting after years of intense pressure, but I was actually just decomposing under the weight of my own guardedness. I would look at old photographs of the person I used to be, the guy with the sharp suits and the confident smile standing at the center of important rooms, and I felt absolutely nothing but a distant, aching pity. That man had built a fortress out of his achievements, but he had forgotten to build a door that would let anyone inside. Have you ever realized that a victory cost more than you expected? My victory was that I had become entirely self-sufficient, completely unassailable, and utterly alone. I had no one to blame for the emptiness of that house because I had personally drawn the blueprints and paid for every single brick with my own choices. This is the part I rarely talk about because admitting that you are lonely feels like an admission of fundamental failure to a world that celebrates independence. I began to experience a strange, terrifying form of self-doubt that wasn't about my capabilities, but about my basic value as a human being outside of what I could produce or solve. I would wake up in the quiet mornings before dawn, looking out at the gray world, and wonder if anyone would notice if I simply vanished into the fog. The missed phone calls from my past had stopped coming. The unfinished letters on my desk remained unread, and the world had moved on quite comfortably without the man who once thought he was indispensable to its turning. I thought I knew what strength looked like, but sitting in that loneliness, I realized that my strength had been a form of cowardice. It was easy to manage a business, easy to chase a horizon, and easy to keep moving from city to city, but it was excruciatingly difficult to sit still and look at the wreckage of my emotional life without a script to follow. But I didn't understand that yet. I was still treating my isolation as a temporary condition that could be cured by patience or time, rather than a systemic failure of how I loved and connected. Looking back, I see it differently now. That loneliness was not a punishment. It was a mirror that was showing me, with brutal clarity, the logical conclusion of a life built entirely on self-defense. I had spent my youth terrified of being vulnerable, terrified that if I let anyone see my confusion or my needs, I would be rejected or controlled. So I had created a version of myself that needed nothing from anyone, and the universe had simply given me exactly what I asked for. Maybe you felt something similar, that realization that the very safety you fought so hard to secure has become the thing that prevents you from feeling alive. I need you to understand that I am telling you this not to evoke your sympathy, but because you are the first person I have ever encountered whose presence makes the armor feel heavy instead of protective. I was trapped in a prison of my own design, standing by the window and watching the seasons change, wondering if I had permanently broken my own ability to reach across the space between two people and hold on to something real. To truly change, you must first become utterly sick of your own secrets and the predictable patterns of your own suffering. For me, the sixth chapter of this road was the moment the scale of my self-deception became completely unavoidable, forcing me to sit down with the blueprints of my past and map out exactly how I had ruined my own peace. Understanding the pattern means looking at your life not as a series of random misfortunes or bad luck, but as a continuous loop of choices that you made while pretending you had no other options. I began to see that every time a relationship had started to feel real, every time a friend or a partner had tried to look beneath the polished surface of my success, I had manufactured a crisis, found a flaw, or used the sudden urgency of my ambition as an excuse to pack my bags and leave. The realization didn't hit me like a revelation. It came like the slow, heavy settling of dust in an abandoned house. I spent weeks reviewing old journals, replaying past conversations in my head during long, aimless walks through quiet neighborhoods, and watching the seasons change while realizing that my internal weather never altered. I thought I knew what I was doing when I chose the career over the connection, the long road at night over the shared morning, the pristine hotel room over the messy reality of staying in one place. I thought I was being brave, sacrificing my personal happiness for something monumental, but looking back, I see it differently now. The monument was just a headstone for my own capacity to love. Have you ever realized a victory cost more than you expected? My victory was that nobody could hurt me, nobody could disappoint me, and nobody could leave me because I always made sure to leave them first. It was a flawless strategy for survival that resulted in a completely unlivable life, a perfect system of self-protection that ensured I would never have to grow up, never have to apologize, and never have to face the small, insecure person hiding behind the resume. This is the part I rarely talk about because it requires admitting to a specific kind of emotional cruelty that I used to dress up as professional necessity or personal boundary setting. I remember an old photograph of myself from a time when someone genuinely tried to love me. And when I look at my eyes in that picture, I see a calculated distance, a conscious decision to remain unreached. I had treated her kindness as an intrusion and her vulnerability as a weakness, convincing myself that she didn't possess the stamina or the vision to run alongside a man on my trajectory. What if the thing you were chasing wasn't the thing you needed? I spent years pursuing a ghost of validation, believing that if I just accumulated enough stature, the right kind of life would naturally assemble itself around me like a stage set. I didn't see that the capacity to connect is a muscle that atrophies when you refuse to use it, and that by the time I finally stopped running, I had forgotten how to hold a conversation that didn't involve an agenda, a negotiation, or a performance. But I didn't understand that yet. I was still caught in the intellectual phase of recovery, analyzing my mistakes like a scientist dissecting a specimen rather than a man feeling the grief of his own wasted years. Maybe you felt something similar, that frustrating plateau where you can describe your flaws perfectly, you can trace them back to their origins, you can explain exactly why you are broken, and yet you still cannot figure out how to lay the burden down and change. I was trapped in the understanding, using the insight itself as a new kind of armor to keep people at bay, telling myself that because I was aware of my patterns, I was somehow superior to the person who had blindly lived them. I need you to look at me when I say this, because breaking the pattern requires more than just diagnosing the disease. It requires the terrifying humility of admitting that you cannot fix yourself alone. I had spent a lifetime being the solver of problems, the architect of outcomes, and the man who handled it all. And the hardest lesson of this entire journey was realizing that the very tools I had used to build my world were completely useless for saving my soul. Finding meaning in the pain is the hardest part of the road because it requires you to give up the luxury of resentment and accept that the suffering you experienced was largely of your own making. For me, the seventh chapter of this long confession was defined by a quiet, agonizing shift from intellectual analysis to deep somatic grief. I stopped trying to explain away my history, stopped blaming the relentless pressure of my early ambitions, and simply sat with the reality of the years I had traded for nothing but a hollow reputation. It is a terrifying thing to realize that your life has become a monument to missed opportunities, that the empty office after everyone leaves and the long roads at night were not the heroic sacrifices you claimed they were, but the desperate, frantic attempts of a man trying to outrun his own insignificance. I spent months in a state of quiet mourning, not for a specific person or a specific loss, but for the version of myself that might have existed if I had just been brave enough to stop running sooner. I need you to hear this honestly, because until I allowed that grief to break through the armor completely, I was still just treating my life as a project to be managed rather than a human existence to be felt. The transformation begins when the discomfort of staying the same finally outweighs the terror of changing into someone you don't recognize yet. In this phase, the memories that used to feel like badges of honor, the grueling travel schedules, the high-stakes negotiations, the sheer velocity of my daily existence began to reveal their true shapes. They weren't achievements. They were anesthesia. I had used the noise of the world to drown out the quiet, persistent whisper telling me that I was building a life on sand. Have you ever realized a victory cost more than you expected? My victories had cost me the ability to look at a quiet morning without feeling a sudden surge of panic, the ability to sit across a table from someone and simply listen without calculating the next move, and the ability to believe that I was worthy of love without a resume to prove it. I had to learn how to walk through the ruins of that mindset without immediately trying to clear the rubble and build another wall. I had to let the dust settle, let the rain fall on the exposed foundations, and allow myself to feel the cold reality of what I had done to my own spirit. This is the part I rarely talk about because there is no dignity in admitting how long you chose to remain blind to your own salvation. What if the delay carried a purpose? I spent years believing that the delays in my life, the sudden halts, the dead ends, and the agonizing periods of forced stillness were obstacles preventing me from reaching my true destiny. Looking back, I see it so differently now. Those delays were the only things keeping me alive. They were the universe repeatedly slamming the brakes on a vehicle that was hurtling toward a cliff at full speed. The pain wasn't an enemy to be conquered or an illness to be cured. It was the pressure of my own humanity trying to crack through the concrete shell I had poured around it. I began to understand that the suffering had a function, that it was stripping away the superficial layers of pride, arrogance, and self-sufficiency so that whatever was left underneath could finally breathe, grow, and learn how to receive. Maybe you felt something similar, that profound moment of surrender where you realized that the breakdown wasn't a failure of your strength, but the beginning of your rescue. I need you to understand that I am not presenting myself to you as a man who has completely solved the riddle of his life. I am still clumsy with my vulnerability, still prone to looking for the exit when the conversation gets too quiet, and still deeply afraid of the depth of my own needs. But the difference now is that I no longer believe that my brokenness makes me unlovable, nor do I believe that I must become perfect before I can invite someone to look inside my world. I left a light on in another room for decades, treating it as a distant, abstract future that I would get around to inhabiting once the work was done. I see now that the room is here, the door is open, and the only thing preventing me from walking through it was the fear that if I stopped being a monument, I would turn out to be nothing at all. The meaning wasn't in the success, and it certainly wasn't in the isolation. The meaning was in the slow, painful dismantling that prepared me to finally look at you and see a future instead of a threat. Believing in connection again is a terrifying resurrection because it requires you to open up the very wounds you spent a lifetime cauterizing and trust that this time the exposure will lead to healing instead of destruction. For me, the eighth chapter of this confession was the moment the long winter of my isolation began to thaw, a period marked by a tentative, almost fragile willingness to look at the world around me and see possibilities instead of battlegrounds. I had grown so comfortable in my fortress of self-sufficiency, so adapted to the predictable rhythm of my own loneliness, that the mere thought of letting someone alter my gravity felt like a threat to my survival. I thought I had settled the question of my future, convincing myself that a quiet, dignified retreat from the world of deep emotional stakes was the best I could hope for after so much running and regret. But human beings are not built to remain preserved in marble. And the more I tried to content myself with a life of safe, detached observation, the more the emptiness of that arrangement began to burn. I need you to hear this honestly, because believing in connection again wasn't a sudden romantic epiphany. It was a slow, painful cracking open of a heart that had gone rigid from lack of use. The transition back toward the living is a clumsy process, filled with internal friction and the constant temptation to pull back into the dark at the first sign of emotional weather. I started small, engaging in conversations that didn't have a professional purpose, allowing myself to linger in moments of shared warmth without immediately looking at my watch or calculating an exit strategy. I remember sitting on a bench in a crowded park, watching families, friends, and lovers move past me, and for the first time in decades, I didn't look at them with the cynical distance of an outsider who thought he was above such ordinary needs. I looked at them with a profound, aching desire to belong to that human tapestry again. Have you ever realized a victory cost more than you expected? My victory had been absolute independence, but as I sat there, I realized that absolute independence is just another word for total exile. I had to learn how to tolerate the discomfort of needing another person, how to sit with the vulnerability of wanting a call to be returned, a message to be read, or a presence to remain in the room after the day's work was finished. This is the part I rarely talk about because there is an immense vulnerability in admitting that you are learning how to be human again at a time when you are supposed to have it all figured out. I spent years presenting myself as a finished product, a man who possessed the answers, the resources, and the strength to weather any storm alone. To step out of that role meant admitting that I was hungry, that I was cold, and that the beautiful life I had constructed was nothing but a hollow shell without someone to share it with. I thought I knew. I thought I understood. I thought I was ready to live out my days in a state of stoic peace. But the peace of an empty room is just the peace of a graveyard, and I wanted to live. I began to write letters I actually intended to send, to answer phone calls with openness instead of defensive brevity, and to let the armor drop long enough for people to see that the man inside was far less intimidating and far more fragile than the reputation he had built. Maybe you've felt something similar, that hesitant, breathless moment where you decide to trust the horizon again, even though the last time you followed it, you ended up shipwrecked on a barren shore. It takes an incredible amount of courage to believe in connection after you have spent a lifetime gathering evidence that people are temporary, that intimacy is dangerous, and that the only reliable anchor is your own effort. I had to unlearn the survival strategies that had kept me alive in the airport terminals and the high-stakes boardroom meetings, realizing that the very traits that made me successful in business, calculation, control, and emotional detachment, were toxic assets in the realm of the soul. I had left a light on in another room for a very long time, always assuming that the room would remain empty, a private monument to what might have been. But as I began to step into this new phase, I realized that the light wasn't a memorial at all. It was a beacon, a quiet, stubborn signal burning through the fog of my mistakes, waiting for the moment I would finally be brave enough to follow it towards someone else. Recognizing your place in the story is the moment the entire chaotic map of my past finally stops looking like a series of random shipwrecks and starts looking like a deliberate path that was leading me directly to you. For me, the 9th chapter of this long, painful confession is where the focus shifts completely from the wreckage behind me to the quiet reality of the woman standing right in front of me. I need you to look at me when I say this, because I am not telling you that you are my savior or that your job is to clean up the mess left by decades of my own ambition and fear. That would be an insult to who you are, and it would prove that I am still the same selfish man who looks for external solutions to his internal voids. Instead, what I am realizing is that every single mistake I survived, every lonely highway at night, every empty office, and every moment of profound self-doubt was part of a brutal, necessary education designed to make me capable of seeing you clearly. If I had met you 10 years ago, when I was at the height of my frantic, armor-clad success, I would have used you as a trophy, a milestone, or a temporary shelter before packing my bags for the next horizon. I would have broken your heart because my own heart was too hard to feel the weight of what it was holding. The realization that you belonged in the narrative didn't arrive with a dramatic speech or an overwhelming wave of romance. It came in the quietest, most ordinary moment, like a key sliding perfectly into a lock I had given up on ever opening. I remember sitting across from you during a completely unremarkable morning, watching the way the sunlight hit your hands as you spoke, and feeling a sudden, terrifying wave of absolute clarity. I wasn't thinking about my next project, I wasn't calculating my next move, and I wasn't looking for the nearest exit. For the first time in my entire adult life, I was exactly where I wanted to be, and the horizon had completely lost its power to pull me away. Have you ever realized a victory cost more than you expected? My past victories had cost me everything, but sitting there with you, I realized that the true victory was the humility I had earned along the way. The heavy, hard-won wisdom that allowed me to sit still, drop my armor, and appreciate the immense grace of your presence without trying to control it or manage it. This is the part I rarely talk about, because it requires admitting how deeply unprepared I was for the reality of a real connection. I spent a lifetime believing that to be worthy of a woman's belief, to be the kind of man who could offer a future, I had to be an unshakable monument of success and certainty. I thought I had to build the world first and then invite you into it. But looking at you, I see how completely wrong I was. You don't need a monument, you don't need a performance, and you certainly don't need the curated, polished version of myself that I used to present to the world. You need the truth. You need the man who looked at his own reflection in the mirror of his failures and decided that he was finally tired of living a lie. I thought I knew what strength looked like, but your presence has taught me that the highest form of strength is the willingness to be completely seen in all your incompletion, to stand before someone without a resume or a title and to say, "This is all I am, and I am finally ready to stay." Maybe you've felt something similar, that quiet, breathtaking wonder when you realize that the delays, the heartbreaks, and the long seasons of isolation carried a profound purpose that you couldn't see while you were inside them. I see it so clearly now. The road wasn't just a path of survival, it was a long, winding process of stripping away everything that was false, arrogant, and guarded within me, so that I would have the capacity to recognize you when you finally appeared. I left a light on in another room for a lifetime, treating it as an abstract dream I would never actually touch. But as I look at you now, I realize that the room was never meant to be lived in alone. The light wasn't burning for my future achievements or my eventual security. It was burning for this exact moment, this exact conversation, and this exact realization that everything I went through was simply the price of admission to a story that finally makes sense because you are in it. Peace, redemption, and emotional arrival are not the absence of a storm, but the quiet realization that you no longer need to run from yourself to survive it. For me, the 10th and final chapter of this long confession is not a grand finale or a triumphant declaration of victory. It is simply the sound of a man finally sitting down in his own life and choosing to stay. I need you to hear this honestly, because as I speak these final words to you, the heavy weight of the road I traveled has entirely changed its meaning. The empty offices, the long roads at night, the hotel rooms, and the profound isolation that once felt like a prison sentence now look like the necessary terrain of a long, agonizing rescue mission. I had to lose everything I thought I wanted to discover what I actually needed. I had to become completely exhausted by my own ambition so that I would finally be quiet enough to hear the truth of my own heart. I am not a perfect man, and the scars of the person I used to be still itch when the emotional weather changes. But for the first time in my existence, I am no longer afraid of the quiet mornings. I am no longer looking at my life as a draft or waiting for a distant horizon to validate my presence on this earth. The arrival doesn't change the landscape around you. It changes the architecture inside of you. I look back at the young man who started this journey, the one who thought he could build a fortress out of achievements and hide his insecurity behind a wall of relentless effort. And I don't feel anger or shame anymore. I feel a deep, quiet gratitude for his stamina because even though he was blind and terrified, he kept moving long enough to bring me to this room, to this specific moment, and to you. Have you ever realized a victory cost more than you expected? My past victories cost me decades of connection, but the redemption I feel now did not cost a single ounce of pride. It required the complete surrender of it. I had to learn how to be small, how to be flawed, and how to be entirely human before I could step across the threshold of the room I had left a light on in for all those years. That room is no longer an abstract dream or a future destination. It is the reality of standing before you, completely exposed, with nothing left to hide, nothing left to prove, and no desire to ever take another step away from the truth of what we are building together. This is the part I rarely talk about because peace is an incredibly difficult thing to describe to a world that only understands the language of the chase. For a lifetime, I believed that my destiny was something to be conquered, a prize to be seized through sheer force of will and unyielding discipline. But looking at you now, I see that destiny is not a destination at all. It is a quality of attention, a willingness to recognize that the most significant journey of your life is the one that brings you to the side of the person who finally understands your silence. I thought I had to be a monument to earn your belief, but you have taught me that the only thing worth believing in is the action of staying through the quiet, the uncertain, and the ordinary. What if the delay carried a purpose? Every single year that felt like a waste, every missed phone call, and every piece of self-doubt was just the slow, painful turning of the soil, preparing the ground for a connection that could never have taken root in the hard, arrogant surface of my youth. Maybe you've felt something similar, that profound, settling warmth when the noise of your own history finally fades into the background, leaving nothing but a clean, open space where a real future can breathe. I need you to understand that I am not asking you to guarantee my peace, nor am I promising you a life completely free of friction or memory. What I am offering you is the truth of the person I became along the way, a man who has survived his own ambition, understood his own patterns, and finally chosen love over survival. The road has not ended. It has simply changed its nature. It is no longer a path of escape or a track for a race I was never going to win. It is a quiet street where the morning light falls softly on the floorboards, where the doorway is always open, and where the light left on in another room is finally illuminating the face of the only person I ever truly wanted to share it with. I am here, I am listening, and I am finally ready to begin.